Welcome to Half in One. I am Valentina, and today we'll be talking about the state of the economy. The health crisis enveloping the world has now latched onto the global economy. Most governments around the world have been and still trying to curb the growing number of cases day by day. Although their responses are swift, they are not without complications as there is no correct way to battling this phenomenon. Countries have mostly adopted two very different strategies to dealing with this pandemic. On the one hand, we have those who have decided to prioritize the economic stability of the state while permitting the virus to spread throughout the population relatively unchecked, with the consequence being a fairly poor health outcome and a large amount of stress on the health system. On the other hand, there has been a government-engineered slowdown on the economy to manage the spread of the virus. This has generally involved closing of borders, introducing social distancing and quarantine measures, and prohibiting specific activities. When policymakers all around the world decided to use lockdowns in response to the outbreak, they took a proverbial leap into the unknown. Not only did they know little about the virus, they knew almost nothing about how the lockdowns would affect people. We are already starting to see how these different health strategies are flowing to the real economy in various countries and territories. What remains uncertain, though, is how sharp the contraction in economic activity and employment will be in the short term, and conversely, when and how quickly economic activity and employment will rebound. Some of the effects of the pandemic on the global economy are as follows. As a consequence of the COVID-19 health crisis and the subsequent global disruptions to aggregate supply and aggregate demand, world GDP is expected to fall sharply during the first half of 2020. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy is expected to shrink by over 3% in 2020, the steepest slowdown since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The IMF's estimate of the global economy growing at -3% in 2020 is an outcome far worse than the 2009 global financial crisis. Economies such as the US, Japan, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain are expected to contract this year by 5.9, 5.2, 6.5, 7, 7.2, 9.1 and 8% respectively. Advanced economies have been hit harder, and together they are expected to grow by -6% in 2020. Emerging markets and developing economies are expected to contract by -1%. If China is excluded from this pool of countries, the growth rate for 2020 is expected to be -2.2%. China's GDP dropped by 36.6% in the first quarter of 2020, while South Korea's output fell by 5.5%. Since the country didn't impose a lockdown, but followed a strategy of aggressive testing, contact tracing, and quarantining. In Europe, the GDPs of France, Spain, and Italy fell by 21.3%, 19.2%, and 17.5% respectively. Different countries and territories are expected to experience divergent recovery paths, with the shape of that path for each location influenced by the interplay between their experience in containing and managing the spread of COVID-19 and the underlying socio-economic characteristics of each country or territory. The analysis reveals trade-exposed countries may take proportionally longer to recover in this scenario, where the C-19 pandemic becomes drawn out compared to less trade-exposed states. Simply, the longer this pandemic continues, the more damaging it becomes to world trade. With the sudden shift away from the classroom and into online learning, many stakeholders are left wondering whether the shift will persist post-pandemic and how such a shift would impact the worldwide education market. Even before the current crisis, changing technologies and techniques were disrupting jobs and the skills that employees were required to be equipped with. The virus has shocked workers across industries into rapidly adapting to these new conditions, thus necessitating the creation of new roles and activities and new specialists. Impacts on the labor market have also made students feel less confident in finding work after they graduate. The graduating batch of 2020, who also form a part of the potential workforce, are now missing out on job opportunities and are having their placements either cancelled or postponed. According to the IMF, the global economy is expected to shrink by over 3% in 2020, the steepest slowdown since the Great Depression of the 1930s. COVID-19 has pushed the global economy into a recession. However, some countries are gradually lifting lockdown restrictions and restarting their economies. India's economy shrank by nearly a quarter in April-June, pointing to a longer than expected recovery. Consumer spending, private investments, and exports collapsed during the strictest lockdown imposed in late March. GDP shrank by a record 23.9% in April to June. It's the worst performance since 1947, likely to push millions more into poverty. Prime Minister Modi announced a $266 billion stimulus package in May, but consumer demand and manufacturing have yet to recover. Unemployment rates have gone up, villages have borne the brunt of economic slowdown, GDP is estimated to shrink by 9% this year. Though policymakers have acknowledged the negative economic ramifications of the virus, there are many other dire unintended consequences that have stemmed from the unprecedented shutdown of society, such as the exodus of migrant workers from cities, hoarding, illegal rationing, hunger, mental health issues, substance abuse, domestic violence, and many other such outcomes, which themselves have indirect repercussions on the economy. Though tragic, these outcomes shouldn't come across as shocking. Poorly thought of government interventions have always had butterfly effects that extend far beyond their intended goals. Friedrich Hayek called this the knowledge problem, which basically means policymakers are unable to adequately assess all the consequences that stem from their interventions. At the same time, this is not a call for inaction by the government. This is far from that. The main takeaway from the entire experience is that government officials need to acknowledge the Herculean task of policy making, admit that there is room for error, and prepare contingency plans for when all hell breaks loose. The COVID-19 experience will remain in memory as one of the biggest reminders of this.